Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to start. After so enthusiastic and very rich opening remarks of our Prime Minister, Mr. Krišjānis Kariņš, now we can go directly to topic related to EU reforms. And the title of this panel by itself was defined in a very provocative manner, asking whether the EU can reform itself. And indeed, we are in the middle of different, very challenging reforms. On the one hand, one can say that the EU is constantly in the state of reforms, otherwise it wouldn't evolve. But on the other hand, in recent years, starting approximately from 2008, 2009, there are crises just overlapping each other, and in the end, it's a mixture of different types of crises, what politicians, but also societies have to face and have to find ways out of those crises. But of course, the main driver of reforms, these are usually EU institutions in concert with member states. So, therefore, the first round of questions which I will ask to all of panelists will be exactly the same as a panel stands. And then, very quickly, I will give floor for your questions. I will turn the floor to you, asking questions to the panelists, because after reading analysis of what were feedbacks from conference participants, they always say that moderators speak too much and audience doesn't have time to ask questions. So I am going to learn from this kind of lesson. Okay, without any further ado, I will start with Edgars Rinkēvičs, Latvian Minister of Foreign Affairs. Can EU reform itself?
Well, actually, in Latvian, we have a very good expression, ne, nu, jā, which means yes and no. And it depends actually how you look. If you look and if you ask a question to any of EU member states and their politicians, do you think that we need a reform? The answer will be definitely yes. But then the big question is, what kind of reform? And then you have at least two drives. One drive is that we need less EU. We need only a single market. Let's forget about rule of law issues. Let's forget about issues that are related to the stricter budgetary rules and so on and so on and so on. And then you have another drive that says, well, let's have a little bit more Europe. Let's have probably even federal Europe at one point. And the trouble right now is that actually what we see that those two kind of contradictory streams are still trying, let's say, to win within the internal EU debate. So I think one thing which is definitely we need reform. We all understand that we need much stronger, much more united Europe. But then the big issue is where we could strike what we sometimes call common denominator.
If I may right away to ask you another question related to what you said already. So again, it's some kind of equilibrium between EU institutions and nation states. How do they approach crisis or different policy issues in the EU. At the present moment, we are facing new European Parliament, which is more fragmented than before. European Commission, its composition is still in the making. And I'm just wondering, do you think that there could be some difficulties with this new composition of Parliament and new composition of the Commission?
Well, actually, we are also facing much more fragmented national parliaments in many of member states. And I think that it also needs to be taken into account. But I do believe that with all that fear before European elections everyone had, now the populists are going to win over, now the radical left and radical right is going to be kind of en marche. We actually came out more or less okay to say that. And also the new commission, the distribution of portfolios, I think is very good, and probably this commission and also this parliament can do more than probably some people would expect, let's say, in May. Especially if we look at initiatives by the president-elect, like the Green Deal issues, and I do believe that the climate change issue can be something that we can really try to unite, and also carbon neutral EU is something that can be a kind of new driving force apart of defense, apart from security and foreign policy and some other issues. So I have some optimism there, but of course we will see how things like next budget, how all those promises made will be fulfilled, and then in about 1 year's time, in the next Riga conference, we will have the panel, is EU failing again or not? That's what we always like. Or is EU is winning finally or not? That really is still where the jury is out.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Minister. Minister Linkevičius, what would be your position on EU's ability to reform itself? Are you optimist or pessimist?
I'm optimist, part of my job, you know, have to be optimist, but when it comes whether to change or reform, of course it must, because of changing environment, we have to adjust to upcoming challenges which are changing, increasing, deepening, widening, and the question is how to do that. So maybe I can suggest just one angle of view, that it's not necessary to change EU treaties, because there's also a question whether we should open, change dramatically something. I believe we should sometimes come to the source and to not invent wheels, but try to check whether we really adequately reacting to what's going on. And it has to do with the gap between institutions and people, for instance. It has to do with the erosion of democratic instruments when we are using referendums, votings, and people are misled by non-action of governments because governments are not willing or not capable to explain things, to lead, and lagging behind sometimes. So populist radicals taking the lead then and even appearing in the government. So we should think about these essential issues. And this is also reforming. It's not necessarily to change something dramatically. And I believe this is really the case. So we have to think also not only about our union, because EU is a world player and potential is by far not yet exhausted. Maybe we are donors around the globe, but I'm not sure that we are sufficiently acting in the political arena. We really can be players as participants in crisis management in many regions, in many crisis situations, which is not always the case. So this is also, we have to think about that. We have to defend values. We are very gifted to repeat and spell out very nice statements, but we have to fight for these values and also fight for those who are fighting for these values as well, even not being members of European Union. And I have in mind, for instance, Georgia or Ukraine. And I'm not saying that we are doing nothing, we are doing a lot, but I mean we have to stay proactive, and this is also about our adjustment to the upcoming challenges. So a lot of things should be addressed, and I believe we will be able to discuss also during the discussion in this conference. I'm, by the way, very grateful for the opportunity to come back to Riga, which is always a pleasure to be.
Thank you, Minister. You mentioned widening and deepening as a term which was very often used before 2004 when 3 Baltic states joined the European Union. What would be your guess in the next 5 years about widening?
You mean widening of EU agenda?
Yes.
Exactly. I already mentioned we really should be more instrumental, more focused. We have to adjust our capabilities, not to duplicate what others are doing. Let me mention one more aspect. Transatlantic relations. We're all concerned about these tests of our unity, and this is also about our union efficiency, not only about transatlantic, so to say, space. So we shouldn't compete, we shouldn't duplicate, we should act in accordance. And by the way, we have much to share what we are doing, Baltic states, especially with regard to hybrid threats, for instance. We really can share with others what we are doing in strategic communications, in cyber, in energy security, and not by accident NATO centers of excellence situated in the 3 capitals of Baltic states also. So we really should coordinate our efforts and widen our possibilities to make impact to the events and developments around the globe.
Thank you. At least we have already 2 cautious optimists who argue that the EU can reform itself. So, Madam Larkin, you are coming from World Economic Forum and going through your CV, you are managing a lot of networks, including think tankers. From your perspective, EU can reform itself?
Well, I want to second some of the comments that were made before, and maybe also put it in perspective that the EU has a very different role, global role, than it had even just a few years ago. We have a very different landscape with new leadership in the US and, of course, a more assertive Russia and China, but also societal pressures, new technologies coming on board, what we call this fourth industrial revolution, will completely redesign and sort of push nations, but also regional organizations in a different position. So we have seen, I think, the positive thing from these external pressures and also from Brexit for the EU is that we see more coherence, perhaps, and more willingness to reform, and even champions within the EU that put forward new ideas for reform. Of course, Macron as the prime example for this, but other nations also have put forward quite bold ideas on the reform agenda for the EU, and we have seen the EU take new leadership on defense issues, on data issues like the GDPR, of course on trade, where a number of new trade deals were done. But as my colleagues have said, there is a lot that remains to be done, and everyone now looks to this new commission, and it won't be the silver bullet, I'm sure, to resolve all the outstanding issues, and it will need to prioritize some of the main issues. And from our perspective, certainly this normative superpower that Europe is and wants to be in terms of setting global standards, setting norms, is very important, particularly when it comes to climate. So this Green Deal is very promising if we can really get alignment on this and action behind it. And the private sector is extremely keen to support this. We have seen this in numerous conversations and also willingness to finance a lot of this. And then, of course, the digital agenda. Europe's leadership when it comes to setting norms, legal frameworks around artificial intelligence, blockchain, a number of these new technologies is very, very, very important, because there's a lot of different viewpoints on how this could look like, and if Europe doesn't lead on this front, it will regret it from our perspective, definitely.
Thank you. Sir Rifkind, you are coming from the UK.
Yes.
It would be different, some kind of strange if I would ask you a question about can EU reform itself. So since who knows whether you will be part of reforms or not, I mean your country. So therefore I will probably rephrase this question. I will ask you, do you consider that reforms which the EU now is undertaking are driven by Brexit?
Okay, I appreciate you don't want a long speech, so I will follow the very wise precedent of King Henry VIII of England, who apparently said to each of his 6 wives, "Please do not worry, I don't intend to keep you long." I'm very conscious that 2 of my colleagues are serving foreign ministers. I am no longer a foreign minister. In Britain, we say, when a minister knows when he's retired, it's when he climbs into the back of his car and it doesn't go anywhere. And that is part of the democratic system. Now, let me go directly to your question, because obviously Brexit is dominating the United Kingdom, but has massive implications for the rest of Europe. I think the first point I want to say, given that I'm in Riga, is there's always been concern whether Brexit would... I was a Remainer, incidentally. That's where I'm coming from, though I wasn't as devastated as many of my colleagues when the decision went the other way. I thought that Brexit, or something like that, was an accident waiting to happen, because from the very moment we joined the European Union 40 years ago, we were a semi-detached member. We opted out of the single currency. We opted out of Schengen. European army, not for us. It becomes quite difficult to argue the visionary case in the United Kingdom when that's the sort of history of our membership. But one of the things that I know concerns our Baltic colleagues and friends is what are the implications for Britain's attitude? Is this like Washington, the White House, I should say, in Washington? Is this some sort of isolationism that has developed in the United Kingdom? Nothing could be more incorrect than to believe any such thing. Not only, of course, is NATO the fundamental basis of our security, and the United Kingdom, along with France, are the 2 most important military powers, and there is no debate in the United Kingdom about weakening or reducing our commitments to NATO compared to what the President of the United States has been hinting at from time to time. But remember also, this isn't just contemporary. If you look at the United Kingdom's history and continental Europe's history over the last 200 years, the United Kingdom has always believed that whenever there was a threat to the stability of continental Europe by some potential dictator or despot trying to dominate, the United Kingdom must join with those fighting against that. That's why we helped defeat Napoleon. That's why we went into the First World War when the Kaiser wanted us to remain neutral. It's why we actually declared war after the invasion of Poland by Hitler's Germany, unlike the Soviet Union and the United States that did not come into the war until the Soviet Union was attacked by Germany and the United States at Pearl Harbor. We entered that war, not out of great altruism, but because we recognize that as a European country, we are as affected by instability in Europe. One other point, if I may, because I promised I wouldn't be long in these comments. The great challenge is how Europe as a whole, including the United Kingdom, responds if and when we leave the EU. You know, Norway and Switzerland have never been members of the European Union. No one ever questions their European identity and their commitment to Europe's values, and the United Kingdom will be the third member of that trinity. So the challenge on foreign policy and security policy is how to show to Russia, to China, to the west of the world, how the EU plus the United Kingdom and other countries that may be relevant speak with a single European voice. It doesn't have to be just the EU, although of course the EU will represent the greater part. One very final comment, if I may, on these opening comments, and it is basically this. You've all no doubt been hugely unimpressed by our inability in Britain to reach a conclusion on Brexit. And you're entitled to be unimpressed. But just remember three things. First of all, this 3 years of relative political chaos has been peaceful. No yellow vests, no mobs in the streets, no buildings being burned down. And when our government has been losing, as it has been losing, control of the Brexit process, it's not been losing it to the mob, it's been losing it to Parliament, because we are a parliamentary democracy. And if Parliament can't make up its mind, it is because members of Parliament are doing what their constituents, perhaps in Riga as well, always tell them. Don't just follow the party line. Make your own judgment as to the national interest, even if it's against your party's policy. And when the nation is divided, and Parliament is divided, and the government's divided, that's why it's taken us 3 years, and we're not there yet. Forgive me.
Yeah, thank you very much. Actually, you reminded another one of the points which was mentioned before by Minister Linkevičius, that the value of Europe is democracy. And the way how UK is dealing with Brexit definitely shows that democracy is at play. So the value of Parliament, the value of legislation, so it's a very big...
That is a hugely important point you've just made, because we're all conscious, and it's been mentioned already this morning, that there is a threat to the liberal values, the democratic values that we all took for granted after the end of the Cold War. Well, you know, there are these problems in each and all our countries. But what's happening in the United Kingdom fundamentally is not an expression of that. Because first of all, it all emanates, rightly or wrongly, from a decision taken by a majority of our people in a democratic referendum. 85% of the population turned out to vote. So that is a starting point. But if you take, for example, Boris Johnson, who is now our Prime Minister, who I don't personally approve of, but on every issue other than Brexit, he shares the same liberal values, the sort of middle-of-the-road political values, as the rest of us. He is opposed to the position that President Trump takes, because he believes, like the rest of us, on climate change, on free trade, not tariffs, on the usual liberal values nowadays, on gay marriage, on all these other issues. And that is a consensus in the United Kingdom. It's this one gut issue, and the reason why we took this decision by a narrow majority wasn't a repudiation of liberal values, quite the opposite. It was a belief that we were conceding too much on self-government, very similar to the Swiss and to the Norwegians. We may have been right, we may have been wrong, but that was the motivation, not a repudiation of liberal democratic values of a kind that most of us would want to continue to identify with.
Thank you. And also, sir, you provided the new formula after Brexit. It would be the EU plus UK. So,
Well, only on
not
major-
minus, but plus, okay.
No, we cannot expect to have the same influence on our EU colleagues when we're not in the European Union. We have no veto or anything of that kind. So the EU will reach its own decision on foreign policy as on other areas. However, what countries in the EU themselves have to decide is when it comes to impressing the Russians and the Chinese and the other major global powers that either exist or will develop, will Europe's voice be more likely to be heard if Germany, France, and other EU countries are on one side and the EU is told, go your own way, make up your own mind? If, on the other hand, on the big issues, not the day-to-day issues, on the big issues, the EU and the United Kingdom, as a sort of EU +1, can see if they start from common objectives, as we did, for example, on the Iran nuclear deal, where we share and continue to share with our French, our German, and other colleagues, the view that Trump's got it wrong and a different approach is justified, then that must be in our collective interest. But if we don't reach agreement, the EU goes its own way. We can't stop them. That's a judgment we've had to come to terms with. So it's Europe as a whole has never meant every single part of Europe, not just Norway and Switzerland. Other countries that might want to join haven't yet been able to. So EU has to remind itself of that when it says Europe says this, Europe says that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Can I just...
Yes, please.
Although Edgars asked me before the panel to behave, but I didn't promise.
I don't expect anything from you anymore.
Just when Malcolm, you said about democracy, just what's your opinion? Referendum, you said, majority of people voted, decided. But are you sure this is really democracy when people are not informed before taking decision, before voting? Because aftermath, everybody looking for the information, what that means, how it looks like, and many disappointed. And that's exactly was my point when I was talking about erosion of democratic instruments. We have the system, we have mechanism we're using, looks nice because people are directly engaged. But if people are misled or informed or misinformed or not informed, or sometimes when we're talking about fake news or this propaganda, it's not about Britain, just in general, also, so to say, brainwashed, and then you're asking them some opinions, this is also a big problem. And we see the situation in your country, if you would agree with me, partially at least, being democratic and using these instruments, but not so to say to the satisfactory level.
It is a very good question you raise, and I think I can answer it. Essentially, we never had referendums in the United Kingdom. It's not like Switzerland. We've not used that as a system. But there are some big issues where, because the political parties are themselves divided, you cannot resolve these matters in a general election, because both the Labour Party and the Conservatives are deeply split. Not just my own party. Jeremy Corbyn is in favour of Brexit. Yeah. Many in the Labour Party are not. So when you have some fundamental national issue of that kind, let me use the example of Scottish independence. We could have behaved like Spain and said, sorry, you Catalans, you cannot even vote on this matter because we don't accept a referendum on... We didn't take that view. We said, look, on this issue, it cannot be divided simply in the normal parliamentary way, because the divisions are of a different kind. And we have a mature electorate, not just Britain, other countries do as well. And this wasn't just a referendum that we had 3 weeks out, it wasn't like Crimea, where they announced a referendum on the annexation and it happens 3 weeks later. Our referendum campaign lasted 2 years, and 85% of the public turned out to vote. And the debate did involve many misunderstandings and misstatements. But that happens in general elections as well. I mean, you can say, when Trump was elected in the United States, did the Americans know what they were voting for? But you don't say we can't have another presidential election because of that. So referendums, I'm not crazy about them. But sometimes there is no other way of resolving a genuine, great national issue. And the very fact that our referendum showed that the population, not just the politicians, were split 52 to 48%, demonstrates why it's the least bad option available.
Thank you very much. We have exactly 1 hour for Q&A. So now please raise your hands before asking question. Introduce yourself. Microphones are there on both sides. The left side from me is more active, so therefore please bring microphone, gentleman here and gentleman there, and lady here. So we will take 3 questions and then you will answer them.
I'm Karthik Desai, Institute of Quantum Mechanics and Strategic Studies, NCI Baltovens. My question is to Sir Rifkind. This is in light of the PESCO agreement. 25 member states of EU have subscribed to PESCO, but UK has preferred to stay out of PESCO agreement. Still, do you think, as you said, the UK is always with Europe in developing the defense capabilities. So would you still be able to contribute to developing Europe's better defense capabilities?
Thank you. Here, please.
Thank you. Tengiz Khaladze from Georgian Institute of Public Affairs. Dear Minister, first of all, thank you for your support toward Georgia and towards Ukraine, and thank you for mentioning our countries. And as you mentioned, we are not yet member of European Union, but we do believe that we will be soon. So that's why I'm asking about foreign policy. So what do you think about future of Eastern Partnership? Today we have clear pictures that 3 countries signed association agreement, and we are advancing our reforms agenda. So what will be in future? How will you see future of Eastern Partnership? Today it's exactly 10 years of this great initiative. What will be next? Thank you.
Thank you. And here, please, the lady here.
Thank you. Maria Golubeva from the Latvian Parliament. The question is to Sir Malcolm. Would you be keen to speak on the wider ramifications of what could Brexit, if it happens at the end of this month?
Sorry, I didn't catch it.
What could Brexit, if it happens at the end of this month, mean for the future of the British Isles? I mean, with Irish and Scottish implications especially, sure. And also for Europe and its future, outlook on common strategy or less sort of common strategy on global challenges. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have 2 questions for Sir Malcolm. Eastern Partnership, I will ask Linkevičius and Mr. Rinkēvičs both answer. And if I could add one more question, which I would like to ask Martina, if I may. There are quite obvious groupings formed within the EU, like Visegrad Group, so Northern Europe. Do you see that there will be more regional formations within the EU, and how it will impact European Union? Okay, let's start probably, Sir Rifkind, with you.
Okay.
Your questions.
Right. First question to me was on defense cooperation. The United Kingdom obviously has a very major defense industry. It has the largest defense budget of all the European members of NATO, and therefore we are keen, obviously, to continue to make as maximum a contribution as we can, and because defense is not a prime responsibility of the EU, in principle that should not be a major problem. However, it does take 2 to dance. And we saw, for example, with the future of the Galileo project, this is about the creation of a European satellite dealing with autonomy from the United States as well as from other countries. We are one of the prime contributors to Galileo, but there has been so far no resolution of whether the United Kingdom would be able to get full access to the product of Galileo if we are not technically members of the European Union, which seems bizarre, but nevertheless that is the position being taken. So the United Kingdom will be very keen to be cooperative on whether it's defense or other matters of that kind, and pay our contribution. If we're involved, then clearly we have to make a budgetary contribution, and we have to accept the rules of whichever organization we're continuing to be involved with. So I hope that responds on that point. On the second question about the future for the various parts of the United Kingdom, if or when we leave the European Union, Ireland and Scotland are very, very different situations. In the case of Ireland, there's a whole series of reasons why the long-term future of Northern Ireland in the United Kingdom is not to be taken for granted, is not necessarily, even without Brexit. The demographics are changing, because the Catholic section of the population has a higher birth rate than the Protestant sector. But the other most important reason is that many Catholics in Northern Ireland never wanted to join the Irish Republic, because until a few years ago, the Irish Republic was very, very backward on social issues. There was no abortion, there was no gay rights. It was very much controlled by the Catholic Church in regard to its values. That is no longer the case. So the social reasons and the economic reasons are different. Brexit is an added factor, no question about it. It will give an added impetus to what might already be a process which is not going to dramatically change in the next 5 years. I'm talking about the next 20 or 30 years. Scotland, very, very briefly, is a totally different situation. The Scottish nationalists want to use the argument that because 62% of Scots voted for Remain, therefore this is a north-south issue within the United Kingdom. What makes that argument more difficult for them is there were two parts of the United Kingdom who voted 62% to Remain. One was Scotland, the other was London. It's the bits in between that produced the majority against. It's got nothing to do with north-south. London and Scotland were very much for Remain. Wales and England went the other way. So that's the starting point. But also, if the Scottish nationalists had their way, if we left the EU and the Scots then demanded another referendum on independence and won it, and used that to try to rejoin the European Union, guess what would be required? A Scottish backstop on the Scotland-England border, because that would then become the border of the European Union. And vastly more trade for Scotland is in the United Kingdom. The Northern Ireland situation is peanuts, because it's tiny communities in comparison. I'm not denigrating it. It's simply a very tiny amount involved, because it's a very small border between two small populations. In the UK, that would be devastating. So, and North Sea oil has run out, which the Scots hoped would. I'm Scottish myself, so I've been very much involved in this debate, and I'm very partisan.
Thank you. What about the Eastern Partnership, please? Let's start with Mr. Rinkēvičs.
Well, I think that you all know that Latvia, like Lithuania, like Estonia, very much supports Eastern Partnership, very much supports European aspirations of countries like Georgia, like Ukraine, like Moldova. However, we all understand that the Eastern Partnership is not ante-room of enlargement. That is a framework that was created 10 years ago to keep as much as possible focus on what we call Eastern neighborhood, and then to have engagement with those countries that really want to conduct reforms, that really want to at some point join EU, and also with those countries that are not actually looking forward to join EU. And I think that we have come to the point where, when we look at next 10 years of Eastern Partnership, at least from our perspective, there are major elements. The first one, we need to have Eastern Partnership because it helps us, the friends of Eastern Partnership, to keep Eastern neighborhood high on political agenda of EU. It's not so self-evident that we have much of discussion in the Foreign Affairs Council or in the European Council about Eastern partner nations. The only way how we can push is that we have regular summits, that we have regular deliverables that we all want to achieve. And that actually helps those countries that have signed association agreements with the EU, those countries that want to join. Second point, I do believe that we need also to have much deeper and wider what we call sectoral cooperation. We have great trade agreements with Georgia, with Ukraine, with Moldova. We have visa liberalization with those countries. That's great. But we can do more in digital arena. We can probably introduce the same roaming system that we have in the EU. In our Eastern partner nations, we can look at creating some digital space, some issues that we all care much, energy sector and so on. However, I do believe that we also need to speak about specific, more tailored relationship with what we call association partners, with 3 countries that have signed association agreements. We need to tackle some challenges and help you like you can help us when it comes to tackling disinformation, hybrid threats coming out from Russia. And then it's very much up to you. When you are ready with your reform process, then we all should create the kind of atmosphere in the EU when nobody can say no to you because you are like EU. And I think it would be in your best interest that also we are succeeding with enlargement and we finally start some negotiations with countries like North Macedonia or Albania that we actually are going to discuss next week. So I do believe that we need to have continuous engagement, let's say, of all EU member states, but then we also need to manage expectations. I catch that you were saying soon. Let's not start to discuss what soon means, but I don't think that it's going to be next year.
Yeah. Thank you. Linkevičius.
But may I just add very briefly on PESCO, although it was not a question to me, but I believe it's very important and where we need UK cooperation because we are really like-minded in the issues of joint capabilities rather than duplication or competition, which is the case in European defense cooperation, because there are some suspicions overseas what we're doing, the lack of understanding what we're doing, and we can prove by doing to dismiss all these, so to say, doubts. And what I have in mind, for instance, with Lithuanians, we leading in PESCO cyber defense rapid reaction teams. And we said that we will use these teams regardless, EU or NATO, because it's important to gain capabilities, to pool resources, and to help nations before crisis, during crisis, aftermaths of the crisis, as example. And maybe that would help to increase, so to say, mutual, trust and, frankly, cooperation. So here we really need UK on whatever outcome of this Brexit deliberations, very close to our defense, so to say, cooperation, and I hope it will be the case because politically it was committed. On Eastern Partnership, I strangely agree with Edgars, but let me add a few points nevertheless, that in my view this is really the rumors about the death of Eastern Partnership, which were spread 6 years ago, are slightly misleading. And we still, well, we're celebrating 10 years, but now we should combine inclusiveness and self-differentiation, because all 6 participants of Eastern Partnership program are really different expectations, well, end game story. 3 front runners, 3 others are, well, not, but they all should feel comfortable in this framework, and our task to make sure that this is the case. With regard to these 3 front runners, not so many running, so good to be front runner, but nevertheless, implementation of association agreements, it's not only about economy. I'm convinced when we were talking about European documents where we're sometimes having difficulties to place European perspectives, for instance, and fix it in the political documents because no consensus, no agreement. I'm always saying this is obvious because association and integration with Europe, what we are doing closer to our kitchen. So really they should keep moving. And also what would be important, in my view, to focus on tangible deliverables, like visa-free regime, for instance, which was very important, but in some countries taken as a given, you know, which is not such. It was a result of big consistent work. But same should be with other projects like connectivity initiatives, getting closer to single digital market, for instance. Roaming was mentioned by Edgars. Even CSDP. To find some way to get closer to CSDP, that would be also very useful. And this is important to show this initiative by the partners. We, those who are trying to help, of course, we will do that, but it should come from that side. So I really believe that the future of Eastern Partnership, same as the past, it's not a given, you know. Success, it's not just coming out of the blue. But everything is in our hands. And frankly, we shouldn't waste time. Even if there are no clear perspectives of the membership to those who seeking, implicitly you are getting closer. And this is not wasting of time, not wasting of the resources. So I'm really slightly optimistic looking into that. And I believe we will really be able to continue in the same spirit and passion how it was done before.
Are you optimistic also about European intervention initiative by Macron? Mr. Linkevičius.
About what?
Mr. Macron's European intervention initiative.
Well, it's about, there were many initiatives by Mr. Macron. Some initiatives should be discussed further, but some initiatives which were launched before, let me mention also like European Army, for instance. I really cannot understand what that means as former defense minister. Maybe Malcolm, as former defense minister, can explain. You know, we really should be very cautious, and all initiatives which are adding value to what we're doing, adding value to our capabilities, are really worthwhile. That would be my say. Because some terminology should be disclosed in details, we have to discuss, should be some in-depth discussions. So let me just say that we're looking positive to any initiatives, but they should be discussed. And we should understand what is the added value with regard to our joint common capabilities.
Well, you can see actually how difficult it is to agree on anything in the European Union. Always there is one that is killing all the initiatives, good or bad.
Yeah. Thank you. Martina, what about regional groupings or coalitions within the EU?
Well, we've had for several years this conversation about the Europe of different circles and different speeds and all of this. And of course, the reality is that there are different circles of influence and different speeds, even when it comes to the euro, the currency, or other things. And this will continue to be so. And now, especially with the exit of the UK, this will sort of rejuggle a little bit the constellation within Europe. And of course, for smaller countries, it makes a lot of sense for them to be aligned with like-minded nations, whether that's in terms of the neighborhood or common objectives like the digital agenda or things like that. But at the same time, and it's good in a way to have these champions and pioneers that drive forward and showcase what works and kind of move forward. But of course, there remains the big issues that need to be dealt with in unity between the 28, 27 members. And those need to really be resolved. So the single market, of course, is a big one that still isn't completed, needs to be completed, and the digital single market also. So these kind of things need unity, but it doesn't mean that the sort of more regional breakdowns aren't important and shouldn't be continuing. And we definitely see interest from particularly the smaller nations now to find new alliances and new allegiances, also with more national pressures to have more sovereignty and to be more decisive on certain matters of interest to them.
Thank you. So now it's time for the second round of questions. So at least this side is getting more active. Please here, more questions. Yeah, and the microphone, please here.
Greetings. My name is Strahinja Subotic. I come from Serbia, and I work at the European Policy Center. I have a question for the two acting ministers of foreign affairs. It was already mentioned the issue of North Macedonia and Albania. Soon we shall know whether the accession talks will be opened with them. So I would like to ask the two of you, what do you hope will happen and what do you think will happen, especially knowing that some countries like France are showing some reservations to open the talks, even though it was postponed for the third time and it was promised by the EU that the talks will start. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So here was a question. What is the microphone? Here is microphone. Where is the microphone on this side, please? Here. Please bring microphone here. Here's one. Oh, okay. And then lady here.
Hello.
Sorry.
My name's Alexander Toshnikov. I sense Belarus. And my question goes to Minister Linkevičius. Don't you see lack of solidarity in the issue of building a Belarusian nuclear power plant as one of the major threats to regional security? And is Lithuania still determined to oppose construction of this power plant? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And please bring microphone here. Lights are hitting my eye. I cannot see everything. Yeah,
so
please.
My name is Jana Natilgan. I'm the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung's director for the regional program South Mediterranean. I'm based in Tunisia, so I thought I bring a bit of a perspective from the southern neighborhood into the discussion. So obviously the southern neighborhood has an enormous disruptive potential for the European Union, but what we have been observing and witnessing over the last couple of years is a growing irrelevance of Europe when it comes to crises and conflicts that take place in the region. The Prime Minister has mentioned the case of Syria, but there are also some other cases. At the same time, what we see is a renationalization of European foreign policy. So obviously, EU has never been a real foreign policy actor, but what it had always stand for was a unified European approach, and this is being lost. And I would like to hear from you your perspective on this. Are we going to see more of this renationalization, or are we going to head under the reform agenda to something that is maybe called majority voting in foreign policy decisions? Thank you.
Thank you. And you're asking question to whom? But not all of them, so I will try to make the conversation more compact. So, okay, another three fantastic questions. Macedonia and Albania, both ministers were addressed. Let's start with your take on this issue.
Linas,
yeah.
will you?
Anyway,
yeah,
you're like twin brothers.
We are going, indeed, we are going to discuss very soon all these issues in Luxembourg. And you're quite right, it's not yet clear enough, but I hope we will be able to reach agreement, open accession talks for both countries. Maybe will be some additional conditions spelled out, but definitely we need this agreement. And with regard to Northern Macedonia, they really did their part, their job, and this Prespa agreement especially came not without pains, not without compromises. Really huge efforts were applied. Also, what I would like to say, we should appreciate the fact of the alignment with the EU policies. You're coming from Serbia, so I want to wish the same to Serbia, to align more to EU policies, in your case, but your question was not about Serbia. But let me use this opportunity to mention. So these countries really showed this alignment, and this is also very important for the future. So in short, I believe we will be able to make a decision, but we'll see. We'll see. Let's wait a bit. On Ostrovets. Yes, we are still the same opinion. We are not satisfied with this project, which in our view, from the beginning of the construction in 2009, it's already built, by the way, just fuel should be brought in, although it's postponed many times, so we believe it's in violation of norms and standards, and we of the same opinion. But we understand that every country has own views, and we're trying to explain this story. We still believe that this is not just Lithuanian headache, but this is also should be regional, because we're talking about nuclear power policy and safety standards with the third countries, and paradoxically, we were forced to decommission our nuclear power plant, which ceased to be operational in the same year, 2009. And in the vicinity, 50 kilometers from my capital, we have another, so to say, nuclear power plant. If it's 50 from Vilnius, it's 150 from Minsk, not a big difference. By the way, from the Daugavpils, also not so far away. So we should really take it not just as a problem of distances or irreliability, but this is a precedent, and we have to be consistent in this regard. So we will explain the story, we'll put emotions aside, we'll try to talk arguments, and I'm really happy that the European Commission is quite supporting this view. Also, I'm happy that Poland, for instance, also announced that not going to purchase electricity from this nuclear power plant. That's very important. We should have to understand that this is a geopolitical project, not of Belarus, but by Russia, to keep us closer to the under control for the electricity grid. And we have to desynchronize our three countries. We agreed to desynchronize from Russia until year 2025, and then subsequently we should synchronize with Western Europe. It takes time, resources, long, difficult way, but we have to do that. So maybe this plant was designed to keep us longer under this influence, and I can make these assumptions. So this shouldn't be considered just as a purely economical exercise. I'm always quoting Belarusian president when he, not once even, he said, nobody explained to him how this nuclear power plant will be integrated into the economy of Belarus. And that says a lot. So economically, it's not feasible, it's not needed. Maybe other reasons. So I'll not prolong too much, just in short. We still of the same opinion, but doesn't mean that we shouldn't talk. We should talk to Belarus, and by the way, we're trying to be even positive, and during presidency in the Council of European Union 6 years ago, I believe we were very efficient, and we will continue cooperating in economy, in transport, export. Tourism is increasing, so I really believe countries also undergoing a very difficult period and pressure and some challenges for sovereignty, I can say that even. So we have to talk to Belarus, and we are going to do that. But since you asked about this particular issue, I have to provide you this clear answer. On this role of Europe, I partially can agree with you. Sometimes this is the case, and the feeling I also mentioned at the beginning, we really should do more. Not always easy. It's easy to say. Countries have different interests. We have 28 players. Maybe we'll be 27. I hope not, but who knows? So we really should take time. Sometimes really very difficult to adjust common policies where we have own challenges, and it's not defending this view, I'm just trying to explain. But you're quite right. I'm of the same feeling. We should be stronger, we should be able to provide with the common policies, and I hope we'll try to do that, but again, this is not so easy to implement.
Minister Linkēvičs.
Well, thank you very much. On enlargement, first of all, I very much agree with Linas when it comes to his assessment on where we are. I think that it is absolutely a matter of credibility of the European Union finally to deliver what has been promised many times. And we failed not because of Northern Macedonia or Albania, we failed actually because some countries are not able within EU to agree on some of, let's say, political issues. So I do hope, I have slight optimism that next week, when we have General Affairs Council that deals with enlargement and then followed by the European Council, we will be able to agree on the beginning of the accession talks with North Macedonia. I do believe also that Albania should be the country that we start accession talks. And from our perspective, we now see this not only as, let's say, process that is based on criteria, but it is also a very much political process. What we hear from time to time, there are many, again, Europeans who are not ready to agree on accession talks, but at the same time they are starting to worry about increasing influence of China, of Russia, of Turkey, non-European nations in Western Balkans. Then we are not able actually to do even the minimum to politically counter that, and I think this is something that we need to take really seriously. Also, even if the question was not asked about Serbia, but I also very much agree with Linas that it is important that the candidate countries, or those countries that are going to begin the accession process, the accession talks, do realign themselves with the EU foreign policy. On EU foreign policy, well, in 2 weeks' time exactly, I'm going to mark the 8th anniversary of being foreign minister. And frankly, first 3.5 years were really great. They were so boring. You came to European Foreign Affairs Councils, you were discussing a little bit about everything, like, you know, how we are going to make Europe great, how we are going to, let's say, influence the world order. And then came 2014. And actually, even before that, Syria case was the kind of bell that we had to, let's say, listen, because we were overly optimistic about European power, about democratic forces in Syria, that Assad will be overthrown very quickly, but we didn't manage actually to rally the international support. Now, EU Foreign Affairs Council is a bit different. I disagree that we are, let's say, fragmented in our foreign policy. We have great examples of unity, and we have also not so great examples. For instance, what we are doing in the East, Ukraine, sanctions on Russia, keeping unity for 5 years, that should be viewed as a positive example. Always somebody can say we could do more, we could do, let's say, harsher sanctions and so on, but still, this is the club of 28, soon to be probably 27, who knows. I still have some doubts about those Brexit dates, but we have managed quite well. And then we have Middle East, where we have been always divided. Since the first day I came to the Foreign Affairs Council, we have never been able to agree even on the common vote in some of the United Nations General Assembly meetings on some of the resolutions, because we had exactly 3 groups, one saying, let's support Israel, another saying, let's support Palestine, and the third one, to which Latvia belongs, saying, if we can't agree, then let's abstain. So that's where the, let's say, EU is at its finest. On one hand, there are good examples, on the other, not. But I also do not believe to the idea of qualified majority vote. Frankly, I think it's a very dangerous assumption. Look, okay, we are going to vote and outvote, let's say, 5 or 6 countries for that or another reason. Do we really believe that we will be able to hold those decisions intact, that they will not be actually the more negative effect at the end of the day? I still remember this qualified majority voting when it came to migration, to quotas, to resettlement and relocation in 2015. Yes, some of those countries were actually outvoted, but it didn't bring unity in the EU. Actually, it brought much more division, and I think that foreign policy is something that, even if it is painful, even if it takes a lot of time, we still need to try to find unity. The maximum compromise I could be able to agree upon is 28 minus 1 or 2, provided that they do not, let's say, then make our life miserable. But qualified majority, in my opinion, would be actually worse instrument for foreign policy than it would be helpful for EU unity in this case.
Thank you. Madam Larkinen, what is your take on those questions?
I wanted to pick up on the Western Balkans because we created this strategic dialogue a few years ago exactly for that reason that was mentioned, that on one hand it is incredibly important to push reforms in the region, but also give them the hope and sort of outlook for accession, because ultimately this part of the world also belongs to Europe and is willing to do this. And let's not be naive, because this will not stay as it is for decades to come. As has been mentioned already, there's a huge influence of other actors not necessarily aligned with the EU and the EU values in the region, and those will only grow stronger. There's a lot of financing in there, there's a lot of presence on the ground, and the EU cannot remain naive and think just by delaying this in 20 years it will remain the same thing. So we are also very much in favor of giving some sort of outlook and concrete measures, and also following up on some of the promises that were made by the EU for accession talks, and give them a hope for access to the EU in the very near future. And many of these countries have made significant progress, and the North Macedonia example is a big one where this took a lot of courage to push this forward, this issue, and find a resolution. So from our perspective, it is incredibly important to put this on the agenda and follow up from the EU side behind this.
Thank you. Sir Rifkind, please, what would be your take?
Yes, I only want to comment on one aspect. My Latvian colleague talked about the consequences of qualified majority voting and how that has changed the nature of the European Union. I think it's almost impossible to exaggerate how much difference that has made. When the United Kingdom joined what was then European Community, it became, along with Denmark and Ireland and so forth, it became 10 countries. And all the major decisions, all the important decisions required unanimity. Now this had a very important democratic consequence, because no country could have imposed upon it any decision that it fundamentally disapproved of. And therefore the decision that government took in being part of a consensus in the EU, it had to explain to its own electorate. There was a democratic accountability. The government had agreed to it, and therefore if the public did not like it, the public could punish their government. Since qualified majority voting has been introduced, and I'm not saying that could be avoided, with 27 countries, you can't have unanimity on every single issue. I accept that. But don't underestimate the consequence of that for the whole democratic nature of the European Union. Because it means that when decisions on some very important issues are being taken, any government, this is not just the British government, any government that voted against that and was outvoted, how does its own electorate have democratic accountability? It says to the government, why does this happen? This is against the interests of Britain or of Latvia or of France or of Germany. Who do we blame? And it turns out that it was a majority of countries that outvoted a minority of countries. Now, if that was on foreign policy, you can understand it. When the EU begins to be involved, as it's been involved in the last 10, 15 years, on internal economic questions, on social policy, on health and safety, on matters that go to the very essence of things that affect the daily lives of its citizens, you do get a democratic deficit when decisions are taken where the electorates, it's no point punishing their own government because their own government may have been as much hostile to what happened as they were. So the final point I make is this, that as the EU looks towards the question, with or without Britain, as the EU looks towards the future, the EU has always liked to say, yes, well, some countries don't participate in certain things because it's too difficult for them. We are a two-speed Europe. No, that's no longer convincing. Two-speed means you all end up at the same destination, but some end up there slightly later. What is already emerging is that some countries either never will want to join, for example, the euro, or will never be able to join. It won't be two-speed, it will be a two-tier Europe. And the quicker that, frankly, comes, in my view, the better. Because Europe isn't the United States. It's not a proto-state, a proto-federation. It is something quite unique in the world. And if it's to have, and I hope it will have, a very long-term, permanent future, then it must have a system for permitting that those countries that want to go for much more integration to be allowed to do so, and those that don't want to do so have an equal right, don't have to negotiate opt-outs, as we had to do on so many crucial issues. Once you have to start negotiating opt-outs, that creates bad blood, it creates difficult negotiations, and there's a lot of unpleasantness about it. It should be an equal right to integrate further or not to do so. And to say that doesn't exist anywhere in the world is true, but nor does the EU exist anywhere else in the world. This is a completely new political structure, and it has to have the maturity to be able to handle a situation that as it grows to virtually 30 countries, the idea you can govern these 30 countries and deal with sensitive political issues in the same way as might have been possible and sensible for 6, for 10, for 12, increasingly, that is simply unconvincing.
Thank you. Now we could go for the next round of questions. And I'm wondering why nobody's asking about Russia. Okay, just please microphone here, there in the middle, and then in the back.
Hi, thank you, Janet. My name is Andris Strasts. I work for the National Bank of Latvia and also a member of the European Council on Foreign Relations. I must say I'm slightly disappointed with this panel. I hope I still get invited next year. But it's been so far mostly about how we deal with the weaknesses, but nobody has spoken much about how we strengthen the strengths. And I think that the EU is still a trade and economic superpower with its 500 million wealthy people in its internal market. It's a kind of emerging regulatory superpower with GDPR, for example. It can have a potential to be a climate superpower. The euro, I have to mention it since I'm from the National Bank, it's the second largest currency globally with about 20% market share. So what I would be interested in hearing from the panelists is how to actually capitalize on these strengths in the foreign policy and how to make those strengths even stronger and the EU even more of a superpower in those domains. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Then please here in the middle.
Good afternoon.
Go ahead.
My name is Boris. I'm Ukrainian student, came from Olesk Dnipro National University, and I have one question for all of you. What do you think about the current situation in Ukraine, especially about Steinmeier's formula? And actually, what do you think about that?
Thank you. And there was a hand there in the back, please. Oh, okay. And then in the front.
Thank you very much. My name is Justine Elferte from Riga Graduate School of Law, and sorry, Janet, I will disappoint you and not ask about Russia. I was wondering, because listening to all of this, we focused a lot on the outskirts, but I feel threatened from the EU internally. I come from a law background, and seeing what's happening in Poland and Hungary is terrifying, to be fair, because some of the EU values that we all value the most, we can count on a few fingers, and all of them are being violated. So with that, I would possibly like to hear a few comments on with regards to this, possibly from the sitting ministers. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, and please here in the front.
Hello, my name is Ketevan Tsikhadashvili. I'm a state minister for reconciliation and civic equality coming from Georgia, basically dealing with conflict resolution. And the reason why I speak, because I have later today a slot and I didn't want to take too much time, but I also don't want to disappoint you. Very fairly, a question about Russia has to come to that panel. And especially as we spoke about Eastern Partnership and the future of Eastern Partnership, we all know that the countries of Eastern Partnership, like Georgia or Ukraine, Moldova, and others, we're not just fighting for our cause in a neutral environment. We enjoy and we are highly appreciative of what we get from European Union in terms of visa-free, DCFTA, approximation, and we're totally determined to go that way. But there is something always holding us back. Those are unresolved conflicts, ongoing occupation. And in this context, this is our fight, an everyday fight for peace, everyday fight for our cause, everyday fight for freedom, everyday fight for reform. And how do you view in this new Eastern Partnership strategy, which needs to be reviewed next year, what is the EU's position and a take on, one, participating in conflict resolution, that to me seems to be a must to have any success in that area? And does it also take to have a strategized approach towards Russia? Because in my view, neither EU reform nor approaches in Eastern Partnership can be done without that. What is your take about that? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. 17 minutes to go. Questions at least for 1 hour, but we could start. Let's, Minister Rinkēvičs, let's start with you.
Well, first of all, okay, I will agree with Mr. Strass. Let's change. We are doing great. We are absolutely keeping Europe great, which is, by the way, true. But that's part of European culture, always to speak about weaknesses and how to correct them, and sometimes also really to forget what are the strengths. What are EU strengths when it comes to, let's say, foreign policy? And by the way, I do believe that they need to be also duly reflected in the next multi-annual financial framework. First, EU is still the largest development assistance provider. I also believe that right now, as we speak, for many reasons, EU is probably becoming the only voice of values and democracy that is still pushing this in all our conversations, be it China, be it, let's say, all the countries in Africa, in Asia. That's always part of political dialogue. We always raise that more or less on bilateral level and always when EU meets those countries. What we can do, and I think that we are close to becoming the real champion if we all will rally behind that, the Green Deal, the climate change, the carbon neutral economy is something that we can provide leadership and work hard. But at the same time, let's not also forget that due to some reasons, we are currently undergoing also a very challenging period. We have been speaking about Brexit. We have been speaking also about the consequences of financial crisis of 2008 that we only now feel in political and social level. So this is not really black and white. And definitely, we very much hope to see you next year in this conference. We are actually very democratic and country, and that honors also freedom of the speech. On Steinmeier's formula, very briefly, I've been in Kiev this Monday, and we were discussing this issue, of course, with my colleague, Foreign Minister of Ukraine. I can't describe what the formula is because that's something that Ukraine has agreed. But let me just say two elements that we strongly emphasize when it comes to Ukraine, when it comes to Steinmeier formula and the whole Minsk agreement. We still believe that the only way how we can, let's say, establish some peace in Ukraine is full implementation of Minsk agreements. I want to underline full, including also the control of Russian-Ukrainian border given back to Ukraine, and only then we can speak about lifting sanctions or softening sanctions. That is something that we are going to insist on in next EU Foreign Affairs Council and the councils and the debates within the EU to come. And second, it is very much up to Ukraine to decide how far it wants to go when it comes to have this implementation dealing with Russia. On Poland, Hungary and Article 7, rule of law, indeed this is a very complex issue. I have always said that I don't want any country to repeat some of those things that have been done in Poland and Hungary. But at the same time, I think that we again are learning a little bit from our mistakes. The way how the Commission started Article 7 proposal without proper discussion with Poland, without proper discussion within Council, showed that actually we tried to push the nuclear button before we actually tried all other means. And I think that we are learning from those mistakes. Now we are talking about peer-to-peer review. Now we are talking about the annual report of the Commission that is being discussed by the Council. And only then, if that doesn't help, we are talking about Article 7. What happened now? We are deadlocked. We all know that we can't vote because there are no votes, and that could be seen as the further encouragement. And by the way, Latvia can't vote in favor for many reasons. Some of the issues are not very convincing. But at the same time, if we continue simply discussing that the whole value of the Article 7 of the procedure is also kind of disappearing. How we are going to get out of this situation? I think that the new Commission has the possibility of new start, and also Poland after elections, also Hungary, should really have a good dialogue and actually to speak on those issues candidly with the Commission, with the Member States, and also to listen and to probably definitely to implement some change. The final point on Russia. I was so much hoping to avoid one panel.
I didn't ask.
So my greatest stake would be that I have talked too much, then I will leave this question to my real great friend Linas. He always has very, very good vision on those issues.
Okay.
And you agree with me?
I disagree in advance, so whatever is said is not the position of the Republic of Latvia anyway.
Okay. So this is our strength, by the way, just to your question, where we can strengthen the strength in the future. On serious note, also many things disappointing me, but I'm trying to look positively, and I invite you to do the same. And it's good. It's better to talk about shortcomings because we need to treat them, because strengthenings will be maybe improve, not by themselves, but it's easier. It's easier. What we have to do really to think what we can do in order to consolidate rather than split. And this is also has to do with qualified majority. It has to do with multi-speed, by the way, projects. We shouldn't overplay this. We have to make sure that we should be as inclusive as possible. At least Lithuania would like to be among those who are doing more. We would like to be more active. And if sometimes we cannot do that, we shouldn't be left behind, we feel. So this is also about common action somewhere and showing our strength. And I agree with you. Potentially, we are really world players in economic development, in humanitarian assistance, but it's not proportionally reflected in the political deals. We have to use this instrument, what we are not doing. It depends on political leadership. It depends also on European leadership, but also on national leaders. So it's up to us, are we able or not to use this strength also in the areas which are not sufficiently used. On Poland, Hungary, I should agree with Edgars. Indeed, sometimes we also should think that we shouldn't mobilize anti-European forces in these countries. Because when sometimes over-pushing, we can really mobilize them, and that would be also counterproductive. We should be patient and engage in the discussions and try to understand what's going on. Because my feeling that this is not so dramatic as it looks like, because there are some arguments behind, and sometimes we need to use this also not just to provide ultimatums or sanctions, which sounds not very unifying. And this is definitely could be a bit dangerous. On Steinmeier formula, different interpretations. I really need more information what was agreed, because when we're talking about Minsk agreements, everybody understands they must be implemented, and we commend efforts. But when it comes to the concrete issues like elections in Donbas area, they should be free. They should be according to Ukrainian law. So that means media should be acting, freely. Political parties, by the way, should act freely. Is it of the same opinion on the other side? I frankly doubt about that. And if we have the dual reading of the same picture, it creates a problem. So whatever will be done, we would commend efforts, but we'll judge upon developments on the ground. And everything what was agreed shouldn't be at the expense of sovereignty of that country, of course. That's also a very important factor, not at the expense of sovereignty of Ukraine. And this is really a condition which cannot be neglected. So maybe we'll continue in the same way to understand what is happening, but I see efforts of current leadership really to engage into peaceful solutions, to exchange military prisoners, and all these factors really are commendable and definitely positive. But condition of sovereignty is a must. On behalf of Edgars, a few words on Russia.
Go ahead.
I already said maybe in this audience, Russia is not superpower, it's super problem. In short. And this is not funny at all because, well, the disturbing factor, whatever we are talking, instead of managing crisis, really trying to create crisis, also testing our resilience, testing our vigilance, and this is the case. So we really should act in consistency because we didn't do that in the past. And it's Crimea, it's not the beginning. Beginning was far back. And let's remember also 2008. Let's remember again 20% of occupied Georgia. And that was like, new normal, what is also test to our vigilance. We doing something was destroyed, and then we again friends. We are trying to start from the same sheet of paper, same as this strange exercise about reset. I also wrote article at that time that reset is nice, but at the same time temptation to push delete button and to start from the scratch, which is not the case. There are commitments, there are obligations, and they should fulfill all these commitments. So we didn't do that in 2008. We got back to business as usual very quickly. And now there are voices again, let's be pragmatic, let's be friends, let's cooperate. It's understandable, but we will do another mistake. I'm not talking about aggressiveness, I'm talking about consistency of our actions, consistency of our decisions, what we agreed. If we'll not, so to say, respect what we agreed ourselves, why we can wish others to do that? Why? So, with all to say, we're really far away from the partnership yet, unfortunately. So this country is not a partner yet, because partnership when you're doing something together. And at least when you are sharing the same risks, challenges, if you're reading the situation, it's not yet by far not the same. So we should admit this as a reality. But only clear and united stance can make a difference. If we'll be split, if we'll retreat, if we'll be so-called flexible, cooperative, that will be another mistake and will lead to another crisis somewhere else. And again, somebody will be surprised what happened, why. It's because of lack of consistency. So I'm really not demonizing that country. And by the way, reminding that Russia is big. It's not just Kremlin. There are also civil society. There are also organizations with whom we need to talk and discuss, to hold dialogue. And what we're doing, by the way, in Lithuania, Russian forums taking place every year and very popular. We're talking in Russian about future of Russia and democratic Europe. How you can call this process Russophobic. You're Russophobic if you don't like this language. I like Russian language. I even can speak Russian. I believe I have many friends. I cannot be Russophobic. So this is also, this should be smashed away, all this propaganda, what was very sometimes efficient from that side. So not possible to disclose everything in short, so I will not take much of your time. My point is in short that let's be consistent ourselves. Let's continue to do what we agreed to do. For instance, sanctions, they must be extended until the results will be shown. Otherwise, we will really show not just our weakness, but also we will create another problems in the future. So this is exactly, it was on behalf of Edgars. Thank you.
Oh, more or less, I will not comment any further.
Thank you, Edgars. Now I will pass the floor to Martina, please. So what would be your comments on questions mentioned here?
Yeah. So on the more optimistic outlook or take on the EU or Europe, I think we've said quite a few positive comments actually on where we're doing well and what needs to be strengthened. And still, much of the world looks to Europe as a place where economic, social, and human values and rights are protected. And it's one of the few places where this is really happening at large scale. And that's why the comment about the rule of law is also such an important one, and why it's so important that the EU finds mechanisms to make sure that this gets somewhat punished or sort of not incentivized, or there's ways of avoiding detraction from that. I do have to say, though, we just published our global competitiveness report, and Europe is one of the very few areas where we actually see a stagnation of improvements across the board, particularly on the economic front, and also in terms of preparedness for this technology revolution and this fourth industrial revolution. So we really need to be still pushing for reform across the region. We need to complete certain things that Europe has promised. And I think the reason why many people constantly push on the maybe more negative parts is because Europe, by definition, is relatively slow. It's slow in making decisions, it's slow in making progress. And I think that's why it's necessary that we do push on some of these things. And then maybe the final thing around where Europe is strong or should build on is its incredible education bases and skilled labor. And we haven't really spoken much about this, but this is such a critical aspect when we think about the future of how do we reskill, particularly in a demographic that's going to be much more of an aged population where we see a real impact on the economy, but also society at large. How do we really reform our education system, reskill people, adapt the labor market on some and build on something that's already really, really strong? I think this is an important element where we can build on our existing strengths, but need to be at the forefront still on this level.
Thank you, sir.
I'll restrict my comments to two questions that were asked are Ukraine and what is happening in Poland and Hungary. On Ukraine, I have an incredible admiration for the Ukrainians. And I think that what they have achieved already explains why the Kremlin and Mr. Putin and his cronies are so hostile to them. We've just seen, not for the first time, but for the third or fourth time, the people of Ukraine have chosen their own president. They have, for whatever good reasons or bad, they have rejected the incumbent, and they have said, no, this is not what we need at the moment. Now, that is what democracy is all about. And for a country like Ukraine that has not had a national history, you've got to go back hundreds and hundreds of years, they have demonstrated that people in Beijing or Moscow who say that democracy is not suitable to certain cultures or certain countries are talking nonsense. The Ukrainians have done that. They're doing it incredibly impressively, and I pay great tribute to them. They have one reason, I would add, to be extremely grateful to Mr. Putin. Mr. Putin has helped ensure that Ukraine today is more united than it's been at any time since it became an independent country. Because when you attack a country, you unite all its people to prevent foreign oppression. And the annexation of Crimea and the destabilization of Donetsk and Luhansk united not just Ukrainian-speaking Ukrainians, but Russian-speaking Ukrainians, who are not ethnic Russians. The vast majority of them were Ukrainians who happened to speak the Russian language. And the idea that your language determines your patriotism is absurd. We wouldn't have we cannot assume in the United Kingdom that the people in Dublin, the Irish government, will be pro-British because they speak English. That would be a very foolish assumption, which is clearly unsustainable. So that's what I say about Ukraine. I think it is very impressive. Secondly, on Poland and Hungary, I think this has brought into play, and not just in these countries, but these are the two closest to us, a very unexpected challenge. After the end of the Cold War in the Soviet Union, and the changes that took place at that time, we all talked about the triumph of liberal democracy, as if it was one thing. And it's not. It's two quite separate things. Democracy on the one hand, and liberal values on the other. And what we've had to come to terms with is that you can have circumstances where one does exist but not the other, or the other is under threat. So Mr. Orban undoubtedly won very easily a large majority in what was overwhelmingly a proper democratic election. He is the democratically elected leader of Hungary, as is Law and Justice in Poland. You can't say they're non-democratic, but they clearly pose a very serious threat to liberal values. So that's the first point I make. The final point I make is that even when it comes to liberal values, the reaction of the European Union, in my personal view, to the erosion of liberal values in Hungary or in Poland has to be very careful. You have to look at what we're talking about. If it is because these countries are very conservative societies and do not believe, for example, in gay marriage or in abortion or issues of a social kind, then we must ask ourselves, well, you know, in Western Europe, it took us a whole generation to get round to believing that gay marriage, gay rights, was something that had to involve changes in our domestic law. Our own public, not just in Britain, throughout Western Europe, were deeply divided on these issues, but a consensus has emerged. Now, that might happen in Poland, it might happen in Hungary, it might not. But that is not a matter to insist on uniformity. It's the other kind of liberal values where the EU needs to be very tough and determined. If the threat to liberal values is eroding the rule of law, eroding the independence of the judges, muzzling the press, destroying the attempts, the rights of the media to criticize and scrutinize what government is doing, if it's enabling corruption to run rife because we don't have the proper methods, and that's quite different. The EU was created not just to prevent another world war starting in Europe, crucial though that was, but also to ensure that the new Europe would rest on democratic and these kind of liberal values. So there, my view, if I was ever asked it, is that the EU should be as tough as they possibly can when it's the erosion of the rule of law that is being considered or implemented as, to some degree, has been happening in both Hungary and Poland.
Thank you very much. Now it's time to sum up our panel, and I would like to answer to Andris about strengths and weaknesses. Only strong ones can speak about weaknesses. If you look at the row of countries, they don't even discuss weaknesses because they are weak themselves. And the strengths of the European Union is exactly in those points which were mentioned during our conversation. Its values, its norm setting, its norm projection. Even the last discussions, the last round of discussions indicated that EU is not focusing on itself. It's very much about being present globally and trying to assist those who are striving for EU's assistance in EU's norms and values. And answering the question, can EU reform itself? Definitely it can. And these reforms should be inclusive, but taking into consideration, of course, differences existing within the EU. And on this, I hope, optimistic note, I would like to thank panelists for contributing to Riga conference. Thank you.